Hi everyone, welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows, a Beatles podcast. Do you remember Jimmie Nichol? Well, if you don't feel bad, that's why he's called the Lost Beatle. You see, in 1964, Ringo came down with a bout of tonsillitis and required emergency surgery just before the Australasian tour. Now, Brian Epstein, being the upstanding businessman that he was, didn't want to cancel the dates, didn't want to let people down, so he tried to convince the other Beatles. John and Paul were pretty easy to convince, but George didn't want to go. He said, "I will not go if Ringo is not there. If Ringo isn't there, you're going to have to replace two Beatles." Eventually they guilted George into going by telling him he'll be letting down all the fans, so reluctantly he decided to go, and now Brian had to find Ringo 2.0. So George Martin comes along and says, "I've got the perfect guy. He's a session drummer, and not only is he a session drummer, he's drummed on those cheap Beatles imitation records that were made for teenagers who couldn't afford real Beatles records, so he already knew the songs." Tony Barrow, who was the Beatles press officer at the time, later commented, "Brian saw it as the lesser of two evils. Cancel the tour and upset thousands of fans, or continue and upset the Beatles." So Jimmie Nichol got a phone call at his home in West London to attend a rehearsal/audition and packed his bags on the same day. Later at a press conference, when John was asked why didn't they use Pete Best, he said, "Well, he's got his own group now and it might look like we're taking him back, which is not good for him." Ringo later said, "Well, it was very strange, them going off without me. They'd taken Jimmie Nichol and I thought they didn't love me anymore." Jimmie's first concert with the band was only 27 hours later in Copenhagen. He was given the mop-top haircut, he was given Ringo's suit, so they didn't even buy him a new suit, and he was taller than Ringo, so his suit was much shorter than it should have been. McCartney said at the concert that Jimmie Nichol was sitting up there and they'd go to play She Loves You and they'd count in 1, 2, nothing, 1, 2 again, nothing, and he'd look up and Jimmie was too busy eyeing all the girls. And so they cut their set down from 11 songs to 10 songs because they had to drop Ringo's "I Want to Be Your Man." And Paul sent a telegram to Ringo saying, "Hurry up and get well, Jimmie's wearing out all your suits." Jimmie later said, "The day before I was a Beatle, girls weren't interested in me at all. The day after, with the suit and the Beatles cut, riding in the back of the limo with John and Paul, they were dying to touch me. It was very strange and quite scary." He was also able to shed some light on how they passed the time between shows. "I thought I could drink and lay women with the best of them until I caught up with these guys." Nichol discovered that aside from acting as a Beatle, he could behave as a tourist. "I went out alone, hardly anybody recognised me, and I was able to wander around. In Hong Kong, I went to see thousands of people who live on little boats in the harbour. I saw refugees and I visited nightclubs. I like to see life. A Beatle could never really do that." He also said, "They were really good to me. They were really nice guys, but they were so tight together that someone like me could never really get in there." Jimmie played a total of 8 shows until Ringo rejoined the Beatles on June the 14th. He wanted to say goodbye to the rest of the Beatles but didn't get a chance because they were all asleep. Brian Epstein presented him with a cheque for £500, equivalent to £10,000 today, and a gold wristwatch inscribed "From the Beatles and Brian Epstein to Jimmie, with appreciation and gratitude." That'd be worth a lot these days. George Martin said Jimmie Nichol was a very good drummer who came along and learned Ringo's parts very well. He did the job excellently and faded into obscurity immediately afterwards. Paul said it wasn't an easy thing for Jimmie to stand in for Ringo and have all that fame thrust upon him, and the minute his tenure was over, he wasn't famous anymore. Jimmie later said standing in for Ringo was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Until then I was quite happy earning 30 to 40 pounds a week. After the headlines died, I began dying too. He resisted the temptation to sell his story, stating in a rare 1987 interview, "After the money ran low, I thought of cashing in some way or another, but the timing wasn't right, and I didn't want to step on the Beatles' toes. They had been so damn good to me." Jimmie received 5,000 letters from fans in Australia alone, and he replied to every single one of them. He was later reunited with the Beatles when his band appeared on the same bill as the Foremost on 12th of July 1964 at the Hippodrome in Brighton. In 1965, Nichol declared bankruptcy with debts over £4,000, 9 months after being a temporary Beatle. After seeing the news of Jimmie's bankruptcy, Paul recommended him to Peter and Gordon, who hired him for a 1965 English tour. During his time with the Beatles, John and Paul would ask him how he was going. He would reply, "It's getting better." Paul would later remember those replies and write a song. That song would be called "Getting Better" and would appear on their 1967 masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul would also make reference to Jimmy Nichol in the film Get Back. He said, "I think you'll find we're not going abroad because Ringo just said he doesn't want to go abroad and he put his foot down. So us and Jimmy Nichol might go abroad." Jimmy Nichol's son, Howard, a BAFTA award-winning sound engineer, was working on the Beatles anthology. Paul noticed that he had the same surname and asked him if he was related. Howard said, "Yeah, he's my dad." Paul said, "Ask him if he wants to come along and do an interview." So Howard went home, asked Jimmie, told him what had happened. He said, "Tell him I'm dead." So Jimmy Nichol, wherever you are, we have not forgotten you, and we would love you to come forward and tell your story. Thanks for listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, a Beatles podcast. Please like or join our channel for more Beatles news and stories. Bye.